Welcome to MedSpa Success Strategies. I'm your host, Ricky Shockley with MedSpa Magic Marketing, and this is where MedSpa and aesthetics practice owners come to discover strategies and tactics that help them better market and manage their practices so they can grow, improve profitability, and have greater impact for their families, their teams, their patients, and their communities. Our guest today is Jessica Hunter, a business consultant specializing in the medical aesthetics industries with over 10 years of experience. Jessica has worked with over 100 clinics ranging from startups to multi-location practices that are generating over $10 million in annual revenue. Before her independent work, she spent 5 years as an Allergan consultant, helping their largest clients scale, and honed her expertise in strategic planning with global names like 3M and Stryker. Jessica holds a bachelor in kinesiology and an MBA in entrepreneurship. She's a sought-after speaker at industry events across North America and Europe. Jessica, thanks so much for being on the show. We're excited to have you.
Oh, thanks, Ricky. It's so exciting to be here.
So I went through your Instagram profile as my research for our interview. I mentioned to you, I always like to dig a little bit deeper, and I like to pick up on some things that you've said in some of the other clips or podcasts that you've been on. So we're going to go through a whole list of things, but I actually pulled this from your website because I think this is a good framework for the conversation. Your growth consulting with your firm, you're focused on identifying key growth metrics so you can identify the changes you need to boost performance, maximizing revenue streams, either via expanded service offering or better patient retention, or obviously a combination of the two, and then streamlining operations to fix inefficiencies that reduce profitability. So I think the questions we have today all tie into probably one of those three buckets, but we'll start with one of the clips I saw you post on Instagram was, so many people think if you have $1 million med spa, that's a successful business, but that's really small in the med spa world. And most of those owners are struggling to pay themselves. So just in terms of owners' pay and a breakdown on profitability numbers, I wanted to go through a few different benchmarks of growth and what you typically see or shoot for. And I know you said every business is different, but if we had to put something on the radar as a goal, because I've seen $1 million med spas that have the owner paying themselves nothing. And then I'm sure there are versions of that where they're still really running a lean operation where they've got good profitability. Do you have any general benchmarks that you're trying to guide your clients toward, even though every business is different?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I think anybody who is just starting up, their own practice or their own clinic versus someone who is established has this question because they're quite uncertain of how do I pay myself? And so the two things you're going to ask yourself right away is, am I an owner and provider in the business? And if that is true and you are, then my suggestion and recommendation of how you're going to pay yourself is you're going to pay yourself to industry standard of what you would pay somebody else who is providing that service. Now, easier said than done, right? And I think, one thing that is just the reality of the world is as an owner starting your own business, I always suggest this, and this actually just happened yesterday where I had someone who's just starting a business and we're going back and forth on, what can they pay themselves? And, they're opening next month. So it's a really real question. And what I always suggest is sit down, take a look, what are your actual expenses? So what are your fixed overhead costs? What is your marketing cost? What is your percentage of cost of goods on your forecasted revenue that you think you're going to do for the first 6 months, and work backwards? What do I now need to live? And I want you to take as little as possible as a business owner and provider in the business. I want you to take as little as possible. So if you know that, let's say you need $5,000 a month to be able to pay your basic bills, then I actually want you to draw that as your salary. I want you to keep as much cash flow in the business for, to be honest, the first 18 months. And after that, you can kind of assess of where your set salary can be. But the reality is we want to be taking just what we need as our base salary. And then I want your owner's draws to be done no sooner than every quarter in the business. And at that time, you can take a look at, what do I need for cash flow? Now that Jessica's told me to forecast my actual expenses, right? What do I actually need for this business to operate every single month for the next 6 months? And then you can decide if you can actually draw some more money out. But going into it saying, hey, and this example just happened is, hi, I'm a provider. I'm leaving another clinic. I made 20%, of the revenue I generated. So I should be able to pay myself that. You're going to keep being in this situation where you're underwater every single month because all you're doing is paying yourself more than you need to be in terms of cash flow generation. So it's a really tricky spot. And I think having that understanding and that mentality of owner versus provider, because now you're the owner in the business. You're going to get that profit when it comes as the owner anyways. So I kind of always lean on that theory of operating as lean as possible.
Is there a point at which you flip that? So you said 18 months. I know kind of just related to our industry, there was an accountant that spoke at one of our trade events that we go to for agency owners. And he was talking about, depending on your goals of the business, it might radically determine in one direction versus the other what money you're taking out of the business. And if he calls, I think one of the versions of it was like harvest to sell, where you're putting yourself in this position where you could kind of do either option. I could keep this business and it cash flows really well for me.
Right.
It happens to be sellable. Or I'm going for maximum growth. And when I want maximum growth, I need to take as lean of a salary, even if I'm an established big business, right? I'm doing $3 million a year, but I'm trying to figure out how to build other locations and get to 10. I need to reinvest in the business. So is that one of those decisions that's very business dependent? Or is there a breaking point where you say, hey, listen, we need to start making sure that we're profitable and that you're taking home a good, healthy salary as the business owner?
I think a few things. I think when we're looking at selling, just as a clarification in terms of an owner-provider business where you own the business and you're the main provider in the business, is that when you do sell, we're going to actually normalize whatever you pay yourself regardless. So if you're paying yourself, $300,000 a year and you're a nurse injector, we're going to normalize it based on your expertise, your experience, and what you're bringing to the business in terms of what you will be paid. And so the rest of that will actually essentially still be profitability. That's still profit, right? We're not taking anything away, and it will normalize it. However, in saying that, to even get to that point to show profitability is you need to probably be reinvesting in your business, either personnel, technology, systems and operations. And so that's why my suggestion is be lean, have that cash flow as an investment, because you need to also pay off your loans and any assets that you just, acquired and all kinds of different things before you can even get down that road. And so I think it's just like understanding that and understanding the hard truth of, again, ownership versus being a provider in a business. Because that's the biggest, I think, misconception I would see is a provider starting their own business and thinking that they're going to get paid how their past employer has paid them as a service provider in the business. Because just remember that the asset, or sort of like the advantage that you have as a service provider opening up your own business, is that you can pay yourself less than you would pay someone else to do it. That's the whole point. That's why you don't hire a social media person right off the bat when you have time. That's why you don't maybe need to hire a receptionist right off the bat when you have time, because you will still have time when you're just starting out to be able to do multiple tasks, and you're going to save on your cash. And that is so key. And nobody wants to listen to that. They don't want to hear that, but that's the reality of it, right? And that is, as a business owner, when you start out, that's what you get. You get, because you have less, you have more time and you have less cash. And as you grow, it's not going to be the case. And so you're going to have to, obviously diversificate your what you do and hire people out. They can do other things. But in the beginning, that's what you have. You have time. And so, that's like, again, hard truths, right?
Yeah. So when it comes to being lean, another rule of thumb I've heard in most businesses, there's some sort of a benchmark for cash on hand. So when it comes to being lean and keeping money in the business for reinvestment, for cushion, does that data point change in terms of a benchmark? Like, is there something that a $1 million med spa or a med spa just starting off is looking for in terms of cash on hand versus an established med spa that's doing $3 or $4 million a year? And I know, again, it's one of those things that everything's relative to each individual business. But if that's even the case, what determines what that rule of thumb is for your specific business?
Well, Ricky, let's go backwards on that. If we're thinking it's $1 million business and 80% of our revenue comes from injectables, and we know just as a service provider business that hinders on paying a provider and having the consumable product to be able to provide that service, we can just run those numbers backwards. So if we know we have to pay a service provider about 20% of the revenue they generate, and our cost of goods are about 30% of what we do for revenue, that's 50% right there. So to be able to do $100,000 a month in revenue, $50,000 of that, essentially, on a real rough estimate, is out the window, right? We've already taken that away. So that's the kind of stuff we need to be mindful of is, this kind of idea that, I did $100,000 in injectables in January. I made $100,000. Well, no, it's nowhere near that. We know that. Hopefully we know that. But if you go backwards on that, to be able to have that cash flow up front, to be able to maintain that business month over month, that's how you understand cash flow. It's really that simple in my mind.
Is there a duration that you want that cash on hand to be able to cover?
Yeah, I think again, we're in the service provider business. And if we were in a different kind of business, there would be different, benchmarks and metrics. But there's no way you could be in this business without having at least 3 months of cash flow for the projected 3 months. If you really want to maintain that revenue, that's just the reality of it. Again, depends on your service mix, depends on what you're offering. But in a real general sense, that's probably the least amount of time that you could get away with it.
I bet you there are a lot of people listening to this that don't have that box checked.
Totally. And listen, I get it, as an entrepreneur and whatnot, like I totally understand that. I think, where this really comes in is that we start, obviously we can owe vendors money for 90 days and we can extend credit and we can do all these things. And I think we're just trying to kind of work backwards on this idea that nothing happens overnight. Things take time. And you're going to have some patience if you want this to be a long-term sustainable business. And that's the key in there is like, if you want to get, frustrated after 2 years and have an asset sell where you just sell your assets and make no money from your blood, sweat, and tears to just get out, that's where you'll be if you really don't put some of these things in place right from the get-go. And I'm talking about our industry, but the reality is it's really reflective of any industry.
Yeah. And it buys you peace of mind too. And that obviously that inflates, right? If we're talking 2 or 3 months of expenses, cash on hand, the bigger the business, the bigger that number is. So making sure obviously that scales as you grow. But I think it buys you peace of mind. It buys you time during a downturn. It gives you the opportunity to take risks and to add on new service areas that might be a little riskier than others.
Absolutely. All sorts of things. And it's a very seasonality sort of, business too. Like we already know the J months are difficult months, right? So, January, June, July, typical, in a general sense, difficult months. And so we just need to plan for that. We need to understand that and be realistic about what that looks like. And I think that where people get, again, into trouble is just having these sort of unrealistic growth expectations when they haven't put maybe the people, the places, and sort of the plan into place. It's just sort of like, oh, well, next month will be better. And it's like, how, what? So
this might be a little digging a little deep, but is there a point at which, so you mentioned like the combination as an owner early on, you're kind of taking your, just keep a lean provider salary, be able to reinvest in the business, give yourself cushion, give yourself opportunity for growth. And obviously you're doing that because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. When you get to a certain point in a business, it seems to me like in every business, there's a breaking point where a business can truly be profitable without the owner wearing a hat in the business, but that doesn't happen early on. So you're not going to early on in a business run 25% margins with an owner who's not involved in the day-to-day. You need scale because every job has to be filled and profitability still needs to be there on top of that. So for owners, for so many of the people that I talk to, obviously they're providers who turn into owners.
Right.
At what point are people looking for profitability? So they're running a truly profitable business where they've got 20%, 15, 20% margins after all replacement hires are factored in, meaning the person that runs the day-to-day, manages the team, hires, performs service. Is there a rough point and a dollar amount at which you see businesses settling into that, where they really truly have a sellable asset?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we think about, again, if we're just talking about straight revenue, which I think is a really good metric for us to talk about because people are pretty, know their revenue quite well. So I think when we think about $1 million business, which means we're generating $1 million in total revenue for a 12-month period, $1 million to 1.2 is where 80% of the med spas in this country are sitting. So it's a massive market, and it's kind of the average, obviously. And so that sort of size of the business, again, depending on the service mix, typically isn't a profitable business in the sense of an owner operating in the business and probably drawing the salary that they feel is fair for their expertise or experience. And typically, if we're selling a business, it's not ever about the revenue, but if you want to use a revenue benchmark to profitability, is we're definitely looking at 1.2 to 1.5. That's where your revenue would really need to sit for you to have something to be able to go ahead and do a transaction or enter into those conversations that a transaction is possible, A, and B, worth what you are expecting, which is, a whole nother question. But but I think understanding that is really important, because until you're anywhere above the $1 million revenue consistency in a 12-month period, you're not even anywhere near those conversations. And you really need to, again, increase your capacity, increase your service offering, really understand your margins and what you're trying to promote before anything.
I love that, because I think there's so much, if you watch like social media reels and clips, you'll always hear like, well, you got to be 20% profitable after all labor is considered. Yeah, but at a certain part of your business, that's not going to be possible. You have to grow past a certain stage for that to even be viable, right? It's a numbers game to some extent.
Absolutely.
If there's one other person helping you, taking half your labor out, you're not going to be able to do that. If you've got 9 or 10 people that are able to make the function of the business work without you, then you get to a point where you actually have a profitable business that doesn't rely on you to be in the business to create the profitability.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot of owners' goals, right? Like they came into this business, as a provider, let's say, not to just be providing 35 to 40 hours a week, right? They're like, I could have done that anywhere. So, yes, I want my capacity to be less. I want, there to be revenue generated when I'm on holidays, when I'm not here, when I'm at my kid's soccer game, right? So I think that's a lot of owners' goals, is that sort of passive revenue that can occur when you have a really established business that isn't relying on just your hands providing the dollars.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, practice owners, Ricky here. And if you're tired of seeing your marketing as an expense, it's time to see it as the investment it should be. At MedSpa Magic Marketing, we specialize in driving predictable, massive growth for med spas. We helped one client generate over 2,500 new clients directly attributed from ads in less than 18 months. And these aren't outliers, this is our expectation. We're HIPAA certified by Compliancy Group, rated a perfect 5 stars on Google, and we provide true consulting and strategic direction to our clients, not just button pushing. If your med spa is able to consistently invest in marketing and advertising, and you want a transformative look at the exact frameworks, ads, offers, and strategies that we use for our clients, schedule your complimentary strategy session with me at medspamagicmarketing.com. That's medspamagicmarketing.com. Jumping into the benchmark conversation, one of the other things you mentioned was that people always ask about average benchmarks, which I've already done a few times. Maybe mine were more aspirational. I was saying, what are the aspirational benchmarks? And you mentioned that, why are we so concerned with average benchmarks? Are you trying to build an average business? No, and that every business is unique, and you need to find the combination of financial factors that make your business work the way that you want it to work. So are you familiar with like EOS or any of those like entrepreneurial operating system type things?
Like you mean like a platform that you're using, or
kind of, but so like there's a concept in in EOS of L10 scorecards, and it's basically like this mini scorecard of, if you had certain things in your business that were happening, you would have confidence that the business was successful.
Gotcha.
If you had to put that just in terms of financials, and I know you mentioned when you're first working with somebody, one of the things you do is first observe and gather information before you make recommendations. So if you're trying to figure out the 3 to 5 data points that show you a business is healthy, and you had to boil it down to 3 to 5, what might those be? I know that's a hard off the cuff question.
No. I mean, this is my wheelhouse. I mean, as you said, any client that I have, I mean, full transparency disclosure is they have to actually give me access to both their EMR platform, so where we can see revenue generated, the actual breakdown, and then whatever their expenses are. So if that's QuickBooks or Xero or whatever platform they're using, because I'm very diligent and really want to understand where those numbers are coming from. And so the quick things that we're always going to assess and look at is understanding, again, your overhead costs. These are your fixed costs. These are, if you didn't open up your doors tomorrow, what are you still paying? And this isn't including, let's say, what you pay for, Zenoti or, one of those, subscriptions or anything. These are just your actual fixed costs. So your rent, your overhead, your lease, utilities expenses, maybe, malpractice, insurance, those things. And then that's a really important margin to understand. We can talk about in a second. But the other ones that we're going to look at, right, is marketing. We're going to look at operations, payroll, and cost of goods. And so we're going to take a look at all your expenses, and we're going to not sort them the way your accountant sorts them, because of course your accountant's going to sort things to make sure that it's, applicable for taxes and all of those things. We're actually truly going to say, hey, we've got some contractors for staff, and we've got some support staff that are, employees. And then we also have a social media person that we hire. And so we're going to actually look at what is your true payroll costs to the actual revenue you generate every single month. And we do that with all the metrics, right? And that will give us a really good understanding of where we're maybe overspending and where we're underspending, all based on how much revenue we generate month to month. So for example, when we look at payroll for, we're going to take a look at what do we pay our team? So support team, providers, anybody who's in the business versus the revenue we generated. And that's going to give us margin. And that should be about between 30 and 35% in this industry. That's a realistic percentage that we're going to see. And although someone might tell you it needs to be lower, the reality is that we're paying, depending on what state we're in, either a nurse practitioner to perform the services, or paying a registered nurse, or we could be paying a physician to come in and do some surgeries for us. Like, we are paying very credentialed people. And so there's an expectation of what they need to make. And so our payroll is always going to be really high. And our second one, of course, being our COGS, our cost of goods, right? So these are all the hard costs that you need to be able to perform the services you have. And this can vary depending on your service mix, what you're offering, and also depending on your vendor and your size, right? Because as you grow, you're going to get more discounts and more cheaper product incentives because you're going to buy in bulk, just like anything in the world.
Such a catch-22 for med spas.
It's such a catch-22. It really is, right? And the other thing is like, we will continue to need these cost of goods to do services. We're going to continue to replenish this, but in again general sense, if we're a typical med spa and we offer injectables, devices, medical grade skincare, aesthetic services, sort of that mix gamut of things, you're going to see your COGS anywhere between 30 and 40%, depending on what stage you're at in your business.
That's just product cost though, right? You're separating labor from product cost in this case?
Absolutely. Okay. They're not connected at all.
Okay.
And, to be clear, even like operational supplies are not the same as your cost of goods. So those are two different things, right? But yeah, and so we want to understand that margin. And right, it's all relative because it's all based on how much revenue you generate. By the way, as your revenue increases, you guys, your cost of goods margin hopefully stays around the same, but your cost of goods will increase. And that's okay because we need the cost of goods to do the services, but it's relative to how much revenue we do. And that's why it's really important when you're looking at this data is we want to look at the margins. We want to look at the percentage to the revenue you generate. It's so key. When you just talk about, numbers being like, $50,000 of your cost of goods in January is absurd. Well, is it? It's all relative. I don't know how much revenue we generated from that.
Yeah.
What was our service mix, right? It's really, you have to understand the business. And I know this is not, it's definitely not my client's favorite thing to do. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously where someone like, myself would come in, because you really do need someone to kind of get under the hood, understand the business before they're ever going to, provide any solutions or recommendations of how to move forward. You have to understand where you were before you know where you're going, and then where you want to go for the future.
So that first number you mentioned, the payroll expense that was related to service, what was that percentage again?
Yeah. So if we're looking at a payroll expenses, and again, we're looking at our contractors, our employees,
doing
our
the work that we're charging for.
Yeah, everything. So you want to be between about 30 and 35% of your total revenue you generate. Okay. So you just take that number and obviously divide it by your total revenue. And it's nice to look at that month to month, because you will see that it will fluctuate, of course, based on, how much you have providers working each month and how much revenue you generated. But, it's a really good metric to understand how efficient your payroll is at providing and generating revenue.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that because I'm not sure I caught the detail on that. Was it that the 33%, the 1/3 number, is your total payroll, or only your payroll that's performing service?
No, it's your total payroll. Great
payroll.
Question. So it's your total payroll. Okay. If we're going to talk about the people that are providing the service in the business, because we would look at all of them individually, I don't go over 25% of what they generate each individually. Now, the reason we go to 30, 35 in a payroll, because we just know that to be true is because we have other support teams. We might have ownership. We again might have like a marketing person. We have other people that contribute to that. If we have employees, I also would include all the employee tax benefits, anything else that's also part of how we compensate our team is all in there. But great point. If we're talking about providers, and this is so important, you never want to go above 25% of what they generate ever.
So your provider payroll should be 25% of revenue max, capping out.
Yeah, and you can do that. Obviously, my recommendation is you would do that with a wage and a commission tiered structure combination. That's my recommendation.
I've got some questions on that too.
Yeah, but just remember that's that your total comp is going to be that for a lot of reasons.
Including if you're owner paying yourself, would that be included in that?
Absolutely. If you're an owner paying yourself, yes, 110%.
Awesome. That's a really interesting data point. One of the things that stands out to me is actually the gap. So if you've got 25% of your payroll that's in service related provider, like people that are actually doing the work, it means to be a profitable and run a good operation, you need to be pretty lean in the administrative function. Like you can't have a super inflated payroll in non-billable, right? Is that am I missing that, or is that a clear takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that we're trying to not pay our support team adequately. It's just this idea that, usually they're paid less, right? Of course, they're credentialed less. Yeah. And so their hourly might be less. Their commission structure is going to be less. But just remember, the support team aren't directly impacting your revenue generation. So of course it's going to be less. The other thing that I'll see here a lot is family members or, other people that are included in the payroll. And so, that's up to, the owners to do, and decide, but yeah, that can be included in there. So we're just always a little bit mindful of that, but it's a really good point. It's a realistic point. And I think where we get in trouble is not our support team. It's our providers, right? Yeah. And as soon as I hear someone say, "Oh, I get 30% of my total revenue, generation," and they say I average $15,000 a month, I mean, we're in massive trouble. We're in massive trouble, right? Because what we already know is that you have to generate a certain amount of revenue to be able to pay a certain amount of money. And that's why a tiered system can be so helpful to a business owner, especially if you're just starting out, about paying on their performance. And as someone grows and generates more money, you can pay them more and your margins will actually go down. And so that's sort of the really key thing that I think most owners would miss about compensation.
Cool. Let's jump to that because I know you had a decent amount of thoughts from the things that I reviewed on provider compensation and talking about you can only pay people so much based on what the business can justify, but you also need a structure that rewards people that are making the business money, essentially. Especially for practices, let's say, that are bringing on a new provider, and they're always stuck between, well, do I eat it and bring somebody on the next person that I'm hiring? Am I hiring another full-time hire? Am I bringing them on incrementally since I'm trying to make sure that what I'm paying them is based on actual utilization? How do you balance that decision and how do you point people in the right direction?
So let's say we've established that we need some more capacity, right? So, we have a provider, they're at capacity, they can't work more than they are. Okay, great. So we've established we need, it's a personnel issue. We need to hire for capacity. No problem. So the first things first is we identify what that looks like. Is that an additional 4 hours a week? Is that additional 8 hours a week? What does that really look like? And then when you have that person come on board, yeah, my recommendation for sure is you want to start, of course, in terms of filling up, 2 days a week, no less than 4 hours is sort of the mandatory situation. And you want to fill up their schedule. But remember that you're going to lose on every provider in this industry because they're credentialed people that expect more than, $20 an hour. And so you're going to lose on them from a certain amount of revenue down. And so it will depend what that looks like. But let's use the number of $10,000. So on average, if you're paying someone in and around that, without going through all of it, but if you're paying someone in around $35 to $50 an hour, you probably don't make any money from them until they hit about $10,000 a month. And you need to work backwards and understand that because you're going to lose on them. And so what you're trying to do, is of course, get them to that level as fast as humanly possible, of course. And then you can start paying them more as they exceed that amount. But where we get a little bit confused is we just end up paying them $100 an hour at zero. And so now we're overpaying them for an extensive amount of time before they've gotten up to that tiered or that tier of revenue that we need them to be at to be profitable. And that's where the issue really comes in. It's not about, are we paying too much? We're paying too much on how much they're able to do. And so that's the part that gets really, really tricky, that we have to understand.
Interesting. So is that part of how you recommend the compensation structure works, is basically this tiered structure based on, hey, if you're handling X amount of business every month for the med spa, you're on a tier program where you're effectively making more money per appointment than someone who's just doing their first 1 or 2 days a week?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So if we were gonna lay this out for somebody, you're gonna hire someone. Let's say you hire a nurse and you pay her, I don't know, $50 an hour. Just gonna work with some numbers here. And the reality is, and they want a commission structure as well as their hourly wage. Hey, no problem, Nurse Jane. We're gonna pay you $50 an hour. As soon as you hit $10,000 in a month revenue, I will pay you 5% of the commission for all the extra revenue that you do over that threshold. So if she does $12,000 next month, then you would pay her 5% on the full $12,000. And you'd be able to do that profitably because it went over the threshold where now you can start making, you're making more money from her. But there's always a threshold there. So it's like from zero, if you're going to give her that 5% at $5,000, you will lose money on her. And so you have to put that threshold in place and understand that of, okay, until they're at a certain amount. Now, if you have a rock star provider and they do $100,000 a month consistently, you're not so worried about this. You do want to stay within that under 25%, because what we know on the math backwards is that's what's going to keep you from, being able to be profitable when we consider all of our other costs. But you're not so much worried about it because they're consistently generating enough revenue to be profitable for you, not just cover their costs, but be profitable for you. So you can, of course, pay that person a higher percentage right off the gate, let's say, if they consistently make that sort of threshold.
So for people that aren't connecting the dots on this, and you have like the new provider who's, making $50 an hour, mm-hmm. and let's just say the ratio is so of the time that they're getting paid when they're serving a client, the ratio mm-hmm. versus what I'm paying them to serve the client and what I make for the client is the same, I'm assuming, as maybe even a seasoned provider. What is it that causes that newer person to not be profitable in the early stages when you look at just the big picture? Like, why are they not profitable?
Yeah. I mean, to your point, yes. I mean, definitely they're probably not generating enough revenue for every hour that they're working versus an experienced provider. And what does that mean? Well, that means that their transactions are smaller. So they're a client's coming in and they're doing 25 units versus, 40 units.
Very common. For you, very common. Listening, you will resonate with this.
Yes,
when you
absolutely.
Go to hire your next providers and you see this popping up, this is the next.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. Again, most of our providers kind of come with this really empathetic, sympathetic kind of energy, and they're used to being caretakers. And so I always say that, this isn't uncommon where they feel like they don't know how to quote unquote sell or, be able to educate on a client or a patient on what they need to, solve their problems. And so there's some things that go on there, but, for the majority of it, that's what it is. It's just the transactions are so low based on what we pay them. Now, listen, if we were in a business where we paid someone $20 an hour, this would all change, but we don't. We have to start higher because these are credentialed people that went to school, and depending again what province you're on, they could be a variety of different credentials. But it's just that thing that we're already starting there. We have to start somewhere, and so we have to pay on performance as they grow and as they get better at what they're doing to be profitable. That's the first thing. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons why we'd want to do that. But yeah, if we're just talking about profitability, that's just how you actually maintain long-term growth and long-term profitability.
I saw another post that you had where you're talking about utilization rate and how many hours are you paying them and how many hours are they there versus how many of the hours are they actually servicing clients. Mm-hmm. What do you typically see are the gaps there, and how do you fix that when you see that there's an issue with the gap?
I think the very first thing is we don't maybe hold our team accountable to the hours that they're there. So the reality is like we don't measure this metric. We don't measure utilization. And again, the nuances of the business can dictate if this is a really great metric for you to measure. If you're just paying someone straight commission, this of course would not be that metric. But if you're paying someone an hourly wage plus a commission structure, for example, we definitely want to understand this. And so anybody who has utilization under 60% in our business, we would need to review that and understand, is this the right schedule for them? Are they coming in at the right times? Are they really maximizing their time? Now, all this being said, you might have a provider who also trains other people, that might also, be part of some of the operations, or maybe is doing marketing support. Like, there are, of course, all these other sort of caveats that can be applicable. But in a general sense, the utilization is really understanding, are they maximizing their time that they're actually there, right? So it's a really good metric in most of my clients' med spas to look at, and typically something that no one looks at ever.
Yeah, that is interesting. Hey there, wanted to briefly interrupt the episode to make a quick ask. If you're a podcast listener, it would mean the world to us if you leave a review for the podcast, whether that's on iTunes or Spotify. It's something I hadn't really remembered or thought of asking for, but it does help us show up more frequently so that we can reach more people with the information that we're providing. So it would mean the world to us if you leave a review on iTunes or Spotify, if you're listening on audio. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you're in the loop for future videos and you don't miss any of the content that we're putting out. All right, switching the conversation to services. We talked about providers and labor a little bit. Well, I guess any other thoughts on labor cost? I guess I had one last question on labor cost.
Sure.
Those numbers, kind of as a general rule of thumb, the 25, 33% in terms of service specific labor versus overall labor. When you make new hires and you're like at this capacity lag where you may be like, all of a sudden you've got more efficiency and less efficiency. I'm assuming you see volatility there as you're making the next hire. Do you break that rule temporarily for the next hire, or is the next hire getting you to the kind of the cap when you're looking at like, hey, we need to be operating better efficiency than those numbers. So when we make the next hire and create inefficiency, we're hovering around that number? Or am I just splitting hairs, getting a little too worried about the specifics on that?
No, every new provider you hire, unless they're the 1%, I call them rock stars, which, by the way, guys, stop asking me to hire you the 1% rock stars. They are very difficult to find. You're usually hiring someone who is, 24 months or less experience that we're building up. That's the reality of it. But on a side note, so you're not usually typically hiring a rock star person. And so you're always going to lose money on them right out of the gate. Like, you're always going to lose money until they hit that threshold, and that's going to take some time. But how we can make that worse is giving them something like a commission structure that it starts at zero, for example, and an hourly wage. That's how we make that worse, right? Because it's just going to take so much more time to get that profitable, if not, honestly, like years. And so what we obviously try to do is create that threshold when we go do the numbers back and we kind of look at it and we say, hey, when they get to this range, we can offer them a commission. Of course, it drives motivation and incentive to, in a short period of time, to actually generate that amount of revenue, to be able to build their own business with their business. It does a lot of things. But yeah, you're always looking at it and you're like, oh, because when I show this to my clients, I'm like, hey, let's just take a look at this, just so you're paying about 60% right now for this person in this structure until they hit this.
Yeah, relative to the revenue they're bringing in, like their labor cost every month, whatever you're paying them on payroll.
Exactly.
60% of billable.
So you're always looking at that and you just know that. And so it's, again, how do we get that as fast as humanly possible?
So that's usually an issue with utilization rate and average ticket. Those
average
two things
tickets,
in combination.
for sure. Because you can imagine in the med spa, you can go from, $200 to $600 very quickly in terms of average transaction. And that's what you're trying to do. Yeah.
This is branching off a little from the financial question, but since we're talking about it, I feel like it's at least good to ask you for your 2 cents. When I've talked to people and they're trying to find a new provider and they want to hire someone that is really good and hopefully coming in ready to kind of hit the ground running, it might be harder to find the person that only wants 2 days a week. So I think I see people at times make the jump of like, okay, I'm not making any money, I'm going to hire the person full time. And now they're really putting themselves in a bind financially to hire that next provider. And I get it from a mentality standpoint. They're thinking like short-term pain for long-term gain.
Yeah.
But how do you go about balancing the logistical concern of finding someone that only wants to work 2 days a week, but can move up into full-time with?
Yeah, I actually find it the opposite. I would like to hire more full-time people, but I find that, in this industry, it's dominated from women who obviously have other, values and priorities in their life. And so they typically only want to work 2 or 3 days a week. But I also think it is just about assessing that, that liability, right? It's like understanding like, okay, does this person actually have the scope to be able to get to that average transaction faster? If they can only do neurotoxin, and that's the only service they can provide, it's going to take me forever. But if they already come with a really good skill set to be able to offer more services in a variety of ways and be able to do multiple syringes and, those kinds of things, that really, moves the needle for me, because then I'm like, okay, I know that I can get them there versus trying to make somebody who just doesn't have that breadth of, opportunity or services to offer.
Yeah. Jessica, how much time do I have with you so I can make sure I don't ask too many questions?
I just have to be off by 1,
okay.
which is in 10 minutes.
Okay, I want to try to roll.
But I can go right up to 1. It's fine.
All right. So on the service side, one of the things I heard you mentioned was we obviously have to understand what services in our med spa are most profitable. Mm-hmm. And I think that for some people, lacking context, they stop at that and they go, okay, well, this service, and so I see this with laser devices, right? People will have a laser device that the cost of goods is very low and the ticket sales are very high. So it's very profitable. Yep. So they're like, okay, well, the solution is I'm going to sell more of these. But the reality is there's not enough demand for that service. So hypothetically, if they could be doing that all day, they'd be really profitable. But there's not enough demand for that service to make their schedule full, essentially. How do you balance a diverse set of services where you have a consideration for maximizing for the services that are most profitable, while also not trying to jam the square peg into the round hole, understanding that there are services like injectables that are probably less profitable, but are kind of the lifeblood of the med spa to an extent?
Yeah, like I think first and foremost, we have to understand sort of some of our limitations or our constraints in the business. And typically for most of us, unless we have this, 10,000 square foot endless space, practice, is it's going to be space, right? And it's going to be providers. And so the first thing you want to kind of do is understand what your offerings are and what your services are. And we always base that back to time, because all of our services take an allocated amount of time. And by the way, that includes our numbing, that includes your prep, that includes your changeover. There's so many things to consider. And so what we want to do is break down all of our services, exactly how they're offered, the allocated time, and what we pay that provider for doing that service, our cost of goods that we utilize. So these are both hard costs, and I call them miscellaneous costs, which is your syringes or alcohol swabs or numbing cream or headbands, whatever the thing may be. And then we take a look at our allocated overhead costs, which again, these are those fixed costs that we do in the allocation of the time the service takes. And then we have a really good idea of like, what does this actually cost us for the time it takes? And what is our price? And price is, again, sort of our variable that we can utilize to really make sure that we're maximizing profit every time we're offering this service. And to your point, Ricky, when you have a large service mix, it's actually harder than having a smaller service mix in some senses of understanding where do I want to focus my time. And it's the 80-20 rule, just like in business, 80% of your time is going to be focused, on 20% of your services. That's just the reality of it. But understanding how and what profit your services are giving you is you have to start that backwards sort of, math again about the allocation of time of everything that it takes and who's doing the service. Now, when we have a service like chemical peel, we're paying an esthetician, I don't know, $20 an hour, right? But the peel takes a full hour. So like, there's all these things where they're like, oh, I only have to pay her $20 an hour, but it takes an hour of your time. So that's an hour in that treatment room that takes away from somebody else potentially seeing maybe 2 clients for neurotoxin, where it's $1,000 because they're $500 each visit. And it's not to say we're not going to offer chemical peels, but it is to say that we have to understand what our sort of allocated resource and time that we're trying to focus on in terms of our service mix. And I think that's the part that people really don't get and don't really understand. It's just about what are we going to put our efforts into and focus on versus what we're not. And we can still offer it. It can still be a part of our menu. It can still play a vital role for patient acquisition, for example, or within a reoccurring platform in terms of reoccurring revenue. Everything can have its own sort of goal or sort of objective in the clinic. But is it going to be something that we're going to prioritize? Maybe not. And you can only answer that question when you've gone backwards and really done the math.
Yeah. So it's people doing an incomplete analysis a lot of times. Like you said, like they're just, well, I only pay that person 20 and I make this. Yeah, but you didn't account for the room is now taken up for an hour. And if we had an injector in there serving 2 or 3 clients, that might actually make us more money. So it's
Yeah,
incomplete
yeah.
analysis a lot of times.
Absolutely. And I think also just like, again, this idea, if you have a nurse injector who's in there and they're like, oh, well, I'd rather have a nurse injector in there, to your point, for seeing 2 clients within that hour, but that nurse injector only does 20 units per visit, right? And we already know that you have to do a certain amount, by the way, of units in neurotoxin, especially if we're using one of the more expensive competitive brands to be profitable, just in general.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand that too, of like, what does that look like? Where are we? And that's where your pricing and your structure and how you're offering things is so important. And those, some of those things like a chemical peel, a hydrofacial, those are really good incentivized for first time transactional, patient acquisition offers. That's what those can be really great for. And then they come in, and of course, we're trying to, upsell and create and do add-ons, sell them into packages, sell them into long-term sustainable client growth mechanisms. And so, anyways, everything has sort of an opportunity and a need in your practice. It's just kind of assessing about where we're going to focus our time and attention. And the reality is, it's probably only 20% of your services. It really is.
Yeah. On the acquisition front, I saw you mentioned that you see so many people, we talk about this a lot, obsessed with customer acquisition costs. Mm-hmm. And that all you're doing, like there are very few services in your med spa where your customer acquisition cost relative to your initial visit revenue is the thing that drives mm-hmm. long-term profitability. It really is the retention game. And you just touched on that a little bit. Again, branching off a little from the finance stuff, but is there anything that you've observed your most successful clients doing well in terms of retention?
Yeah. So the most successful tactics, I think, in terms of that is, again, if we're going to heavily invest in patient acquisition, is that we have a really solid plan of how to acquire that patient long term. I mean, that's just the number one thing. And what that looks like is, again, an initial offer of the best value offering that we can give, and then 2 options for a downsell. And so, for example, what this might look like is you have now done a signature 30-minute hydrofacial as your incentive offer. And they come in and we want them to go into, a deluxe offering, not the platinum, but the deluxe. It's right in the middle. It has a really good value for what we're doing, right? And we want them to do a 3 package. And so we're always going to start there. And then the downsell, might be to our signature package or, whatever it is. But you always start with the key, most valuable, most value add that you can have for your service offering. And then you have those downsells. And you never sell one. You need to sell a package or a reoccurring platform, which would be a membership or something along those lines. But it has to make sense to the client. You can't just jump to get there, right? If you're acquiring them through a hydrofacial, they would need that incentive offer to align with what they just came for you for, okay? And so that all has to kind of make sense. And that is very strategic, by the way. That is, when I work with my clients, we map that out. Like, what does that look like? What is the first, initial sell? What is the downsell? Then what? And we do it almost like sort of an algorithm of they said yes to this, where do we go? And we really map it all the way down to medical grade skincare. And again, that one transaction that we're trying to get for that $159 facial that we've just, acquired them, that first transaction to my clients, I tell them it's zero. It means nothing. It usually just covers our costs for all those things I just mentioned.
Yep.
And so the important piece is we have somebody now. We have the right demographic, the right audience in our chair to tell them about everything that we can offer to solve all of those problems. And that's a systematic way that you do that. And again, you get them into, a one-time initial offer is getting right into a reoccurring stream. That is the only way that's successful. Otherwise, you've just wasted your money on a transactional offer that they're just going to go and get another one from someone else, and along they go. And you've just, spent thousands of dollars probably acquiring them for nothing.
Yeah. Don't wing it. Don't wing it on the back end. This is a business that relies on retention. Like the entire name of the game is retention for most of you. All right. Last question, and then we'll wrap if we have a second to wrap this last question. Yeah. Practices. We talked about that whether your goal is to sell or not, you should build it as if you were going to sell it, because that's going to mean that you're operating and owning a business that's going to serve you as the owner and do what you want it to do. Also happens to coincide with being a sellable asset. You said to make sure that if this ever is going to be on your mind, start thinking about it early. Don't wait until okay, I think I want to do something. You need a lot of data to get to the point where you can sell your practice. And So what does that look like? Cliff Notes version of what are the things you want to keep in mind if you're trying to structure yourself for the ability to sell at some point?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I mean, we always go in that mindset of, understanding that we're just looking to have options for the future. That's it. And whatever those options maybe you have, but that journey is actually the exact same as if you want to make a passive business where, you're not providing all the revenue versus, doing a transaction and selling and partnering down the road. It's all the steps are the same. So if I can leave you with like 3 quick things they're probably the most important is, of course, key person risk. So it might be you as a provider, it might be your manager, it might be something, but you need to replicate the key person risk so that someone can eject you out or eject that person out and be able to fulfill it. And so that comes with number 2, which is your operations. Systematic and really set processes that you want to have for your business are so key. And nobody wants to come in to something that's a total chaos that they're going to have to do it themselves. And so that does start with your technology. It starts with what you use. It starts with your platforms and that you're utilizing in them in a way and they're structured in a way that allows for systematic evolution of your practice. That's an easy one. And then number 3, I would say, is just understanding your payroll. I mean, it's so key of understanding, do you have the right providers doing the right service mix in the right amount of volume? And that sounds a lot easier than it is. But you really need to understand that. You need to understand your team because, like I said, we're in a service provider business. That's never going to go away. You need people to be able to do these services. And that's something that I think people just kind of don't really understand well.
Yeah, it's the non-sexy thing. So they're like, I'll do it. It's the thing people always do. I'll do it next month.
Totally. And I get it. I get it,
But man, it gives you
it's the hard work.
Unlock on that data, the visibility in that data, I think just gives you so much power to make decisions that make your business better. Awesome. I know we're at the end. Jessica, where can people learn more about you if they want to work with you? We want to make sure everything's in the show notes as well.
Yeah, a couple places. You can obviously go to hunterconsultingservice.com. You can read a little bit more about me, some of my client experiences, and again, about how I do things, which is sort of that 4-step process that we outlined in the beginning of the show. It's, very systematic about how I work one-on-one with clients in the medical aesthetic space and have for over 12 years. So that would be a great place to start. And of course, you'll find my Instagram on there too, if you want to see, embarrassing content that of course I have on there. Those are all good places to start.
Yeah, we'll make sure all those are in the show notes. Is there a minimum threshold where it's like, hey, this is probably the point you need someone like Jessica or people out of the gate, like, hey, get clear on this stuff early?
Yeah, I mean, I have both. I have both that are looking to sell versus some people that are just startups. But what I would say the most common is probably that 18-month mark where you know enough to know you don't know. And I think that that's a good place for a lot of people because you've tried a few things and realized that having someone in your corner to really give you that guidance and shape your resources is really impactful to your business.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I got, per usual, about halfway through my questions. So love to have you back. I always think these things are interesting. I know I dig. And thank you for the detailed explanations and for giving us some of those benchmarks. We look forward to hopefully having you on again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ricky.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This podcast is a production of Med Spa Magic Marketing. If your med spa or aesthetic practice is in need of digital marketing services, help with advertising on Facebook, Instagram, Google, lead generation, and booking more appointments, please visit medspamagicmarketing.com.